Okay, welcome to tonight's Windows to the World program on India. So we have a visitor this evening who is a professor of geology at Radford University. I know him very well, and I'm not going to read from his curriculum vitae, which was way too long. So I'm gonna feature a couple of highlights and just say that Parvinder Sethi came to the US at about the age of 22 to do his PhD in geology at NC State University. And he did his master's in geology, is that correct? In Belgium on a UN scholarship. He was one of a very few who received the scholarship, so it was a group of folks from several different developing countries who spent 2 years in Belgium. And he has many more things to talk about. He's a great professor of geology, but that's not his focus this evening. So I'm going to let him embellish as much as he wants, or as little in that area. So I welcome you, Sat Sri Akal Ji, Parvinder Sethi.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me, and to the Georgia Southwestern University community. I'm really happy to be here. And as Sarah mentioned, my talk tonight has very little to do with geology, more with humanity. And I think for any liberal arts community, you would understand that the latter of the two, humanity rather than geology, is so much more interesting and important to our holistic growth as human beings. So my title tonight is going to be, as you can see, Through the Lens, Finding My God and My Country as a Sikh. The overall structure of tonight's presentation is going to be about 20-25 minutes of my speaking to you about what is Sikhism, how does it factor into the kaleidoscope of religions in a country as diverse as India, and then my own journey as a Sikh, which led to a couple of pretty severe ups and downs in my life to the point where I am today. And after that brief introduction to Sikhism and a little bit about my life journey, I would like to for you to take a look at some images that I will reference during my presentation. And these are photographs taken over several years and will consist of 3 individual soundtracks, each about 5 minutes long. And so there's going to be about a minute break, and then we'll jump straight into the slideshow, take a look at the images, and I'll then open the floor up for any questions you may have. So please don't feel shy. Can we dim the house lights about halfway, please? Thank you. So I wanted to start out with talking about that we each have a story. If you look around and take a look at those who surround you today and sit next to you or close to you, you may not know them more than their name or where they're from or which class they may be sharing with you. But if I were to ask you to, on a piece of paper, write down a synopsis of what their story is, chances are you'll be forced to draw a blank. And that's just something that's human. And part of my effort tonight is going to be to bring to the center stage our innate tendency to label people by what we see without a word having been spoken, and construct in our own minds some very powerful platforms from which we then operate. And if I can succeed in having you rethink that tendency we all have, especially in today's political, sociological, economic environment that we find ourselves in the midst of, I think it couldn't be more relevant. So I'd like for you to take a few seconds and think about if you were to have this conversation with yourself as to what is my story, if you were to sit with somebody who you'll never see again, ever, and the person would pay you $1,000 for 5 minutes of listening to your story. What would that story consist of? What have you done with your life so far? What has life done to you, perhaps? And you might be able to answer that with a lot more confidence than the next question, which is, what will your story look like 10 years from today? Or 20 years from today? And I am in a luxurious place to be able to pose that question because I have had the luxury of being able to look back and answer that question. And answering that question is going to be, and sharing that with you is going to be a bulk of my presentation tonight. So regardless of which major you're here for, regardless if your professor has required you to be here for extra credit or you just found your way here with friends, if you can just think about where your story is and the next couple of screens, the rest is just sit back and enjoy kind of thing. Well, we have stories, but we each also have fears. A fear, a dominant fear, or perhaps multiple fears. And these are kept well hidden, either consciously, because they almost paralyze you to even think about, let alone talk about it, or subconsciously, which can be a pretty wicked strategy of the brain to preserve the body. Some things are just so horrible that they're best left untouched, undealt with, but in my case, they totally surprised me as well. And after that, the question is how you want to deal with it, if at all. I would also like to add that as you see these photographs of the dozens of faces of people that you've probably never met before or seen before, they're half a world away in India. And chances are that you'll probably never cross paths with in your lifetimes. I would like for you to think about, well, what about these people? Each one of these faces, do they have a fear? I wonder what kind of fear they have. And would their fear be vastly different from mine or similar? And my premise is that fear is a very strong highest common denominator. It is a very strong commonality that each of us have with each other. Having talked about fear, let's talk about joy. Each of us hopefully has witnessed joy or felt it. We also have the capacity to create joy. And I'd like for you to answer to your own selves or to this person paying you $1,000 for 5 minutes. What is it that brings you joy? And how hard do you have to work at getting to that place? And how difficult or accessible or inaccessible getting to that place is for you on a daily basis? And then as you look at these images, think about what can you tell from being playing detective as you see these images, what brings these people joy? and you will likely find that they're very similar things. So let's get into my story. I will share some of my fears with you, some of my joys with you, and as far as my own capability of creating joy, I have discovered that it has been through a camera. Very little to do with my profession as a geologist, but then again, I have always considered myself a thinker first and foremost, an artist, and then secondarily a scientist, and never the other way around. My discovery of the camera as my source of joy was as accidental as can be, and was born out of a very dark place, which I'll take you to in just a minute. I was born in 1966. If you can imagine, right now in India, a little child being born to some exotic religious family who would then, 45 years later, find himself coming to this campus and giving a presentation about his or her story. I mean, that's exactly what happened to me. I was born to Sikh parents, and if you don't know what the Sikh faith is, I will be giving you a primer on that. We'll look into Sikhism. And to start out with, it's a very young religion. It's only about 450 years old. And the way the religion began is that at about that time, India as a country was dominated by Hindus as a majority religion, and the country was invaded and occupied by the Persian Middle Eastern rulers, and they were very strong fundamentalist Islamic people, forces, armies, and they were mass converting all the Hindus to Islam, and anybody who resisted was executed on the spot. This went on for several generations, and finally one of the leaders of the Sikh movement or set of principles, notice I'm calling it a set of principles rather than a religion, and that's intentional. He felt that a human being should have the right to practice whichever religion he or she wants, and to find the path towards higher ground and not be forced into anything. And that is a unalienable God-given right that should not be trespassed upon. And he called for volunteers. He called for 5 volunteers who would rally around him and offer the first resistance to the hundreds of thousands of Muslim, Islamic occupants of India at the time. Naturally, his 5 volunteers were killed, but the movement caught on. And about 100 years later, there were enough Sikhs in the country who died protecting the Hindus' rights to their own faith or to their own religion that the Sikh armies were able to drive the Persian rulers back to Persia. And since that time, the Hindus and the Sikhs have been much like a family. Obviously, one saved the other, and we never had any issues whatsoever. Today, Sikhs form about 25 million in terms of a population, about 3% of the Indian total population, so clearly Sikhism is a minority faith. This is a painting of the last leader of the Sikhs, Guru Gobind Singh, and you'll notice that he has a turban, you'll notice that he has a beard and mustache, and he has these 2 swords which are actually much smaller, and they're worn as a necklace as a reminder of strength, of spirit, and ability and willingness to stand against oppressors. So what are the fundamental principles of Sikhism? As I said, it is not a religion, it's more a set of guiding principles with which to live by. For starters, and I'd like for you to think about some of the very obvious contrasts between Hinduism and Sikhism. Hinduism as a religion that is thousands of years old is steeped into the caste tradition, and that you're born into royalty or you're born untouchable and so on and so forth. And even if there are laws against it in the country of India today, when you find yourselves in the villages and so on and so forth, the religious doctrines are still pretty powerful and in place and functional. The Sikh faith does not recognize any class, nor any race, nor does it bias with gender as far as women and men's rights are concerned. Everybody is completely equal on the same platform. A woman will have equal sociological, economic, political rights as a man. And again, that's I believe a reason for that is that it is such a young religion, that not a religion but a faith, that the gurus or the leaders of Sikhism who wrote the holy book, which is what we follow today as a set of principles to live by, they were able to almost cherry pick the best parts of what they found from religions from all over the world. So in a certain sense, well, not in a certain sense, but in a very broad sense, this is a pretty progressive way of looking at things. So let's delve a little deeper. Sikhs believe in one creator without a name and 1,000 paths to that creator. And that creator is not a person, nor is it a deity, nor is it a demigod or an idol. It is simply a way of living and being. There is no human incarnation. And that is very different from most religions that are very, very old. It's a collection of values to live by, and the Holy Book, which is what we follow, again, as a set of guiding principles, and I would like to emphasize guiding as a very important part of this. They're full of metaphors, and I think personally a huge problem arises when people forget the difference between what is supposed to be guiding versus what is absolute, or what is the place of a metaphor in religion that was founded 10,000 years ago versus what is it that it's guiding us to conform to 10,000 years later. And if you can just recognize and get comfortable with that difference, you'd be that much better off in terms of the quality of your own personal life, is my belief. So there is the script of the Holy Book, and under this blue covering is the book, and this is what we go and bow our heads to. It's a collection of wisdom from the 10 generations of gurus or leaders of Sikhism. You'll notice the woman holding a fan. She is Caucasian, and there are hundreds of thousands of Sikhs in California, in Washington State, Idaho, and in several territories of provinces of Canada. So it's a very national religion at this point. And that is something a lot of people don't know about. The practice of living as a Sikh involves letting go of these 5 sins: pride, lust, greed, anger, and attachment. And if you think about just these simple words, for those of you who may have delved deeper into religion, you can see similarities of, or echoes of other religions. Attachment, that's desire, that's the founding principle of the Buddhist faith. anger and lust. Definitely you can recognize teachings of Jesus Christ in that, as well as greed and so on and so forth. Now here is an important slide. This is not an image that I took, and I want to be very clear about that. This is from the Indian Forum archives. But if you were to see people like this on the street today, we all can pretty quickly assemble an image in our mind as to what we would think, or which parts of our brain would be kicked into activity versus which others which would be subdued. And it is a survival instinct that we tend to make labels. We tend to come up with labels. But my question being that, think about what labels would you put on a group of people walking like this outside. And then, if you were to think about what I've just shared with you are the principles that these 5 men have lived their entire lives by. They're some of the most peaceful people you would ever come or meet. Some of the most powerful, as in courageous, people who you could count on almost like a religious 911 if you were feeling oppressed by a certain religion and you wanted to turn to somebody for help. And if I were to show this image to the entire country of our United States today, all of us can pretty much imagine what sort of a reaction we would incur or induce. And that is where we have to slow down and reevaluate how we operate with new situations. A couple of screens. Why do Sikhs look the way they do? Why do they have long beards? Why do they have a turban? Why do they carry swords? Well, not necessarily an open sword like this in the streets, but they'll have a little token one. And why do they wear orange or blue? And there's reasons behind that that go back to the days of its founding 400 years ago. Sikhs are not supposed to dishonor the Creator's intention by cutting hair. So up until I was about 25, 26 years old, I had long hair down to my waist. And I had it in a bun. And to be neat and clean about keeping your bun atop your head, you wore a turban. And that's it. And I had a full beard and a mustache and so on and so forth. Do not harm the body with tobacco or other intoxicants. Do not eat sacrificial meat. Do not commit adultery. And here, towards the upper left, are some of these principles embodied, where you see a steel bangle, and I used to wear that, grew up wearing one, and simply it's not something you beat up somebody else with. It's simply something that is very slender and reminds you to be strong as steel. The small knife or dagger or a sword, and a very tiny comb to keep your hair neat and clean, well combed in a bun and a turban around it. There's nothing terribly frightening about somebody who decides to groom their appearance with these materials. And in this photograph on the right, you can see one of the Sikhs being baptized by holy water. And on the photograph on the bottom left is a temple, a Sikh Gurudwara, a temple from California. Be always absorbed in meditation and prayer. Make an honest income by honorable methods. Share your earnings and selflessly serve others. If you had not heard what I just shared with you about Sikhism, and I were to tell you, these are all Sikhs. very few of us would be well equipped intellectually or knowledge-wise to call out a difference between these turbaned men and perhaps the turbaned men you would find as extremists in Afghanistan or dozens of other countries. My point is that you could not find a more pious, peace-loving person than a Sikh, or a more fierce warrior for protecting the religious beliefs of other people, no matter how different from theirs, and a set of core principles to live by which are very progressive, egalitarian, and gender equitable. And these, I believe, are good values to have and live by today. So next time you see somebody with a turban, or somebody who just looks different from you, in which form, manner that it may be, just try to think of this presentation. And lastly, community meals and community service are inseparable parts of who a Sikh is. And again, a photograph, if I were to cover the bottom half of this image and just show you the top half with just the faces and the turbans, and you wouldn't have any idea as to what was happening, what was this group of people doing, what were they doing, it would be a very far reach from the truth. But this is what we do in our temples following the reading of parts, a few pages of the holy book, is volunteers cook a meal and everybody sits down on the floor, kings, queens, politicians, people, farmers, peasants, convicts, together. At the same level, there is no differentiation, we eat the same food. Live by the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Forsake greed and material ties to the world. Respect all faiths and individuals' rights. How many religions talk about this doctrine, this guiding principle today in your view? Just something to think about. Defend the oppressed. So as far as Sikhism, I think that's plenty for now. And as for the other religions in India, it is pretty amazing that a country as diverse with religions, languages, it has 26 different languages, about 300 different dialects, and it is the oldest and the biggest working democracy in the world today. And it has always fascinated me as to how such a diverse group of people could get together and get along for such a long time. My own example is being brought up in a Sikh family. I was born a Sikh. My mom, very rarely, very unusual for her time, had a master's in English literature in India back in the 1950s, and wanted us to have a head start with the language of English as we were preteen boys, my two brothers and I. And so she arranged to have us attend middle school and Christian missionary schools, where the first order of the day was to read the Bible and say the Lord's Prayer. And so I grew up with that. So I did read the Bible. I read the Bhagavad Gita, the Hinduism tenet, the Quran of Islam, all by the age of 15. And that wasn't anything unusual. When you live amidst such different religions, you get to know about them. And what I discovered was that all of these religions are inherently good religions. It's the interpretations that are pretty wacky at times and insane and fundamentalist, not the religions per se. And the parts of these religions, in my opinion, that do seem atrocious and extreme are there because people have interpreted them as metaphors, as literal things and not as metaphors. And so an eye for an eye and a limb for a limb is a metaphor. It's not that you just go for an eye and a limb. I'm sure all of you understand what I'm talking about. I had Hindu, Muslim, Christian, atheist friends in school and college, and life was just wonderful. And then on October 31st, 1984, everything changed, at least for my world as a Sikh. Indira Gandhi, a prime minister, was shot, assassinated by her 2 Sikh bodyguards. And you can go back to the history books and learn about the reasons why she was assassinated. But the fact is that over the next week, three days to a week, thousands of Sikhs, men, women, children, were burnt alive all over the country. They were raped, they were butchered. The country went on a killing spree. Hindus, the police and the army was complicit, and it all happened under their very eyes. And the politicians at the time were so angry and let this genocide occur. So the next 3 days, more than 3,000 Sikhs were killed in very brutal ways. Here are some images from those 3 days from different parts of the country. And you will notice that in a lot of these images, there's police and soldiers standing by. So what was happening in my world? This. The entire faith was paying the price for the actions of 2 Sikh bodyguards. My family and I, we hid in our home for 3 days. We begged our Hindu neighbors, who knew us better, to not tell the mobs that we could hear on trucks outside that there were Sikhs in this home. They would have burnt the house, killed us, and we survived. But I lost very close friends. I lost relatives. My family lost a pretty substantial amount of wealth with buildings and properties being burned in other parts of the country. And over the next 3 months, when we would constantly get stoned and thrown stones at coming back from school and going to school, my parents finally told us to leave the country. This was no longer a country for us, and they worried that we would survive. And that was 30 years ago. It was right about that time I started having nightmares. Excuse me. And you can read this, but there would always be these 3 dreams. They were all always brutal. I would always wake up with a sweat. And the commonality was I was being chased so mobs could kill me. And I literally did not know what it feels to have a good night's rest for almost 15 years. And I believe in a lot of ways I was compensating for my internal stress by scapegoating that, oh, it's just my PhD program. Or issues with marriage or getting tenured as a professor, heavy work at work, paying bills and whatnot. I had no idea that there was a much more excuse me, powerful, devious mechanism in my subconsciousness that I wasn't aware about. Until this day, a very sharp counselor diagnosed me with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and that was 15 years ago. So I started therapy, but I still refused to visit India. I just could not even read about the place. And when my therapist asked me that it was time for me to go back to the library and look up some of the newspaper clippings from October 31st in that week in 1984, I just told her to essentially go to hell. And I was done with her, and that I had had enough of this nonsense, and that I would never do that. And if she never wanted to see me again, that was just fine with me. And then we just sat there, and she said, well, just think about your reaction right now. Would you consider that a calm and normal reaction? I said, maybe, maybe not, but that's the reaction I have. About a week later, it finally dawned upon me that there was all the proof that I needed help. And that is a classic giveaway for PTSD, is that you're not ready to confront something that has been the root cause of it. And then when I did go back to her and started working over the next 3 or 4 years that it took me to finally be able to read those articles, to visit India and not feel paranoid every single moment, it was baby steps. It was step by step. And today I can talk about it without missing a beat. But my parents were getting old, and I wanted to go see them. And it would be awful. The nightmares would start January 1, the December of which I had air tickets to go for 2 weeks. This is how bad it was. And I knew that I would think about this for the entire year, fret and be anxious about it and have nightmares, and then go there and couldn't wait to just come back in a plane. So that's how terrible it was. And so it was during one of those trips where I told one of my close friends that I wasn't going to take my camera, and he said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, I just want to get it done with, and that's it. I don't want to photograph, I don't want to do anything creative. And he said, just take your cameras. Have it there if you feel like it. Photograph, if not, don't. So I took the camera. And what I found is that I finally started to see. I finally started to see what was around me, but it was always through the camera. It was from behind the lens. It somehow felt safer to look around through the camera lens than stare straight into the eyes of people who in my mind were still mobsters. And so I had never intended to have such an intimate relationship with photography. As I said before, it was completely circumstantial that I started to use my camera as my crutch, almost as my invisible barrier, which would allow me to go back and reintegrate myself into the country, which had almost cost me and my family our lives, and which I felt had totally taken out joy for the last 15 years of my life, as I had fled the country to Belgium and then to the US, and paid some very, very heavy costs, personally and professionally. Today I still take long walks, not just in India, but mostly wherever I go, I take my camera along. It's my best friend, it's my voice, it's my sanity mechanism. And in a world where I know I can be judged very quickly and harshly if I don't open my mouth, or I don't show them my very long resume, I can use my photographs in blogs on Facebook, on my gallery, as my view of who I am. And so this is how I have used and benefited from photography as an art form, and how it's really saved me. And today has brought me to a place where I find joy much more easily than I used to just 5-10 years ago. So my question to all of you is, what is your art form? What is the mechanism with which you find your joy? And if at this point you're not entirely convinced that, well, this guy talks a good talk, but how can you take a camera and start feeling like you found your God in your country again? That's BS. Well, I invite you to take a look at the slideshow, which we're going to see now. And my premise or hypothesis is that I would not be able to take such photographs if I wasn't able to connect in a very basic way with all these people in India. And what I've found, which has nourished me, hopefully you'll get a glimpse of that as you look at these photographs. And I'm just thankful that I've been able to bring closure and start a beginning to something which was a very, very dark place. And so, going back to the beginning of the presentation when I said, think about a fear that you have and think about what you need to do to get joy, I'm really wanting to put a plug in for the arts. And to encourage you to do something, to create something, to write, to sing, to dance, to find joy through these venues, and you'll be much, much richer than you could have ever imagined. So, I've already explained how I felt safe or safer to see from behind my camera. But what I also discovered was I started talking and I started opening up and I started chatting with these people. And I learned that they had just as traumatic lives as I had had. It's just that I've been such a closed up shell that I never really allowed myself to learn about their fears, their joys, and their stories. And that is when I realized it was okay to be happy again. It was okay to finally, after 30 years, let go of my fears and my anxieties, even though there are nights they'll creep up on me. And there are situations where I'll very quickly, within a microsecond, revert back to that paranoid person. But for the most part, it's rare. And it was okay for me to be a Sikh and wear my turban when I go back home again. And so this is how I discovered my God and my country with a camera. So as you watch this slideshow, ask yourself, all these faces, clearly, do you think they have fears in their lives? Do they have joys? Are they really that fundamentally different from you? When it really comes down to what keeps people up at night. And what would be your art form if you had to battle with your demons? God forbid you get cancer, or one of your family members, or lose a leg or a limb. Where would you go for help? If there were very few people around in a very new place, what art form would you channel your energies through? That's most of my talk for tonight. What I'm going to do now is show you the slideshow. It's got 3 soundtracks, so let's wait till the end of the third soundtrack. The 3 are about 5 minutes each, so 15 minutes. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them after the slideshow. So if we could zero out the house lights, please. Thank you. Raj, can we have the lights on, please? And I'd be happy to take any questions, if anybody has any. Yes.
What is the difference between the red, yellow, is there, like, is it a different religion, the red, yellow colored turbans?
What's the difference between the red, yellow colored turbans?
Yeah.
Yes, it's based on religion, and the saffron or the orange, yellow colored turbans are predominantly used by the Hindus, the Hindu priests, and people of that faith. But as far as the red and the blue and all the other colors, it's whatever you want. It's totally cosmetic. Any other questions? Yes.
Dr. Sethi, when you're in India and taking pictures of people, essentially right in their faces, do you have a different sense of humanity, of what it is to be human, compared to your life in the United States? What's the feeling that you have when you look at these people's
Oh goodness,
faces?
that's an excellent question. How do I feel when I photograph people with my camera right in front of their faces? Well, for one thing, I use a zoom lens, so I'm not always in their faces, but some of the better photographs come from being actually close to. And so, oftentimes I will engage them in a conversation where I genuinely want to just know something about them. And I can still speak the language, and so if I'm careful about the kind of clothes I wear, I'll blend right in. And so that's a very strong advantage of being able to have that conversation and then pull out my camera and then ask them if I can take some photographs. And some of you may have noticed there was this gentleman with a very dark face, piercing eyes, and a yellowish saffron colored robe on his eyes. He was holding his hand like this, giving a blessing, sitting in front of a shuttered shop. And he had never ever been photographed before. And so he had never seen a camera. He's one of the untouchables from the Hindu religions. And I spoke with him for a good 20 minutes and then spent another 20 minutes photographing him. But I was able to calm him and his anxiety by showing him the photographs I took on the back of the camera. It was the first time I had used a digital camera. And once he saw what was happening, it was just a mixture of being amazed and being relieved and all those emotions going through him. And then I would ask him to smile, and as soon as I would look through the camera, he would just turn stone faced, because it was almost as if he trusted me enough to follow my instructions, but he was terrified as to what was going to come out of that glass front when I hid my face behind the camera. So he would always bring on this very serious facade. As far as how it made me feel, very privileged. I consider myself a U.S. citizen now. I have been for decades. And it's one of the most powerful emotions is when I land in the U.S. airport as a port of entry, Washington, D.C. or Charlotte. And it feels like you've gone from a farmer's market into a hospital's ICU. Everything is so spick and span and clean out here and deadly quiet. And in India, it's everything's out on the streets. There's so many sounds and smells, and people are laughing and crying and pooping and dying all on the streets. And there are several cultures where that's also a common phenomenon. Some of you may know the National Geographic photographer. He's one of my idols, has always been Stephen McCurry. And he spent 25, 30 years of his career photographing for National Geographic in the Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India predominantly, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And somebody had asked him the same question: how does he compare the West to the Southeast Asian cultures in his work? And he said something that's always stuck with me. He said, I quote, "In the West, everything is private and nothing seems to be sacred. But in the East, nothing is private and everything seems sacred." End quote. So if you think about that, it packs a punch, packs a lot. So mostly a feeling of being privileged as far as material goods are concerned. As far as the level of happiness, I wouldn't know what to say. It's hard to say if the average person I've photographed is happier than I am just because I have a car in my house. I think that's a more important question, but I don't know the answers to that yet.
Is there more humanity in the poor? Is that why you photograph the poor?
Yes, I'm really glad you picked up on it. I tend to gravitate towards those with less materials to offer, because I think what that does is it's less layers that they have to cut through to really expose who they are. Living in the moment, living with what they have, they're just more authentic, more genuine people. And I couldn't care less about the other kind of people. So, yes, you will notice that I tend to go for the heart of the matter, and mostly it's the face, it's the eyes. And to me, it's that connection which has really helped me be brought back, more so than photographing rich people or rich buildings or material goods. Yes?
I was just curious, how often do subjects you approach refuse to be photographed? And are there some cultural or socioeconomic groups that seem more reluctant in general?
That's an excellent question, and a question most of you who like to photograph or would see yourself traveling and photographing will come across. You'll come across a variety of behaviors. And I would say about 1 in 4 will flatly refuse. And out of those 25%, I would say 90% have been those who are the haves versus the have-nots. And it has gotten worse over the past 5 to 10 years because these people who are hesitant to be photographed are the more plugged in into the global internet and to the privacy issues and concerns, which are valid, but they're also bordering on paranoia. And so they somehow feel that, they tell me flatly, this is a very common remark, and you'll get it too if you walk around with a camera pointing at people, is, okay, well, you seem safe, sure, I'll let you photograph me, but don't you put this photograph on the internet. And I always get a chuckle out of it. And a couple of times I've been feisty and I said, you're good looking, but you're not that good looking. We'll spend the next run back home, and the thing uppermost in my mind is to upload the photograph onto bazillion forums. And now I just think about it, smile, and then I just walk away. But somehow people feel like they're all so exposed, which really tells me that they're all doing something wrong. Because otherwise, what would you, if you're so afraid of being photographed, don't step out of your home. But the other thing is, and I've not had to use this more than a couple of times, there are people who threaten me to hurt me, to physically take my camera and beat me up. and make it a point to come after me. And it's taken every bit of diplomacy and self-preservation to walk away from it. And it can happen. Somehow people are just not having a good day and they just need a trigger. And you pointing a camera in the face is a trigger. And in a couple of cases I've had to point out to them that this is when they would start talking about law and police and do you have a right to photograph me or not? Are you violating my personal space? And I've had to give them a on-the-spot lecture about international law and Indian law. States very clearly if you're in a public space, you have no right to be, you can be photographed legally by anybody as long as that person who takes the photograph does not use the photograph in a negative fashion, in a defamation kind of a manner, or insulting kind of manner. But anybody in an open public space, at least in the US for sure, you can photograph anybody. Now as far as going up to their face, where you can feel their breath on your face, you're chancing it, because that's the personal space. But from 10 to 20 feet, the law protects us. But again, where's the law when you're surrounded by 100 angry people? So I've had to use that a couple of times, but it's very cultural. In India, some of my favorite subjects have been the slums and the villages or the cities where kids will come around half naked and covered with dust and filth, and they've never seen a camera before, and it would be the most genuine interaction. And I miss that in the US. I do. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's a tragic story that I'm afraid happens too often around the world, conflict like you described. Can you tell us a little bit about the current state of affairs for Sikh people in India and general relations in India?
I think time does heal, and in this case it's done its thing yet again pretty effectively. As far as normalization of relations are concerned, it only took about 10 years maybe. And today, it's part of history. Few radical Sikhs will claim never forget that this happened to us, so it doesn't happen again, and so on and so forth, the usual gamut of emotions. But they're back marrying each other's families and living next to each other as things are back the way they were before. And I do not know if I'd be able to say the exact same thing had I never left the country. So it's easy for me to say because I just removed myself from all of that. And in a certain way, I abandoned it, just as it had abandoned me. But going back and observing, it's not a scary place anymore. Not at all. And you're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions?
Are there Sikh bodyguards to the Prime Minister currently?
Yes.
Yes.
There. And why did she have Sikh bodyguards? Because the Sikhs, as I said, they are a pretty strong warrior class. And if you delve into the Indian history, you'll find that when the British occupied India for almost 300 years after the Persians left. Yes?
I want you to bring up that the previous Prime Minister itself was a Sikh.
Yes. And in fact, Manmohan Singh?
Yes.
Dr. Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister for several years up until recently, is a Sikh. So, and at the time Indira Gandhi was assassinated as a Prime Minister, the President was a Sikh, Yani Zail Singh. So Sikhs are a very integral part of the tapestry of the country. And other than for that dark chapter, things are back to. But the interesting thing for me reading through history is when the British ruled for 300 years and when they forced the Indian population and the Indian soldiers to fight for them during World War I, they chose the Sikhs and a sect called the Rajputs, the desert soldiers, and they chose a sect called the Gurkhas, which are from the Nepal area. And they were very clever about choosing these three clans, if you will, because if you go into military history of World War I and the role of the British and the Indian forces, these three they would strike fear in the hearts of their enemies. And they're almost maniacal in their fury. And the Indian government knows that, and it's a very time-honored tradition of fighting for the rights of others, and it's not a surprise that two of our closest bodyguards were Sikh at the time. Other questions? Yes?
How many times would you say you go to India, and do you do any humanitarian work for the people that you go and see?
I have been on an average every 2 years, and as far as humanitarian work, it's making prints of photographs which I promised to the little kids in slums, and then going back the next day or the next week and actually keeping my word and giving them prints. I guess you could call that humanitarian. I just see it more keeping my word. As far as other than that, no, I haven't done any humanitarian work.
Was that something you'd be interested in? 'Cause you said
It would be something I'd be interested. It would have to involve photography in some way. And I think part of the reason I'm almost thinking that makes me sound selfish, maybe I am, but thinking aloud in my job day to day as a professor, I give so much of everything that I have, emotionally, mentally, physically, that I just need a place to recharge. Maybe it'll change after I retire. Any other questions? Yes.
I appreciated your speaking about gender parity with the Sikh religion, but how is it then that there's still very traditional gender roles within the family or access to education for women in higher education? I didn't see it being equal. So can you
You're right.
speak to that a little bit?
How was it when you were back home for Thanksgiving? Mama Sue still does most of the cooking, even when your dad was alive. And here he was the president of the university and PhDs out the wazoo. So, seriously, to answer your question, I think the frustration is the rate of sociological change is so much slower than the rate at which we age within a generation. It's on the order of hundreds of years. And it's just slow. But you've got to begin somewhere. So, there's a lot of discussion going on about Oscar so white, and clearly there's a disconnect there in the Academy. And sure, they could have just avoided that. Chris Rock could have just totally refused and or had somebody else come and do the show, not talk about the white elephant. But it's done now. It's out in the open. And it's unfortunate that sociological change has to be catalyzed through Hollywood, but why not? We'll take whatever works. But I think it's a pace of, especially as being a geologist, I mean, we deal with millions of years. And that's the time frame I usually operate with on a day-to-day basis. And then to have to think about sociological change taking hundreds of years. In geological time, that's instantaneous. But I think it takes time. And I think that's the irony of being human, is we can hold a better situation in our one hand and yet cling on to the status quo for such a long period of time. Anybody else? Questions?
What is that, the red dot in?
You're losing popularity points. All the people in the back saying, "Oh no, we have a question. We gotta stay." Of course, you gotta stay. You gotta stay till it's 8 o'clock. I have 2 minutes, 2 full minutes. The red dot is very observant of you. It's worn on 2 occasions. When a woman gets married, the first year, she's supposed to wear that. Don't ask me the reason why. It could be X number of reasons. And for the elderly women, they'll wear that on days that are auspicious, religiously significant in their faith. So certain days you'll see a lot of women wearing that. Usually it's a religious event, but usually after marriage, they'll wear that for the first year. Keep the other males away. Anybody else? Yes.
Why did you decide to cut your hair and shave your beard?
Oh,
And
all the time.
and do you still use photography like as a method of therapy for yourself?
Yeah, excellent questions. Why did I choose to cut my hair? I was finishing up my PhD, and it was time to interview at other universities, and I knew that going there with a full turban and a full beard is going to freak people out. And I could feel as Sikh as I wanted on the inside without having to freak people out. And so I cut my hair off, and I landed the first interview that I attended. Now, I don't know how much of that had anything to do with it, but seriously, it tells me that I wasn't strong enough at that point. I was still playing in to my fears. At which point, at that point, I didn't know about PTSD or what I had to do. But I was just playing it safe. And what was your second question?
If you still use like photography as a method, like to help yourself with.
Oh, absolutely. I have very, very little friends. Usually none. Maybe 3 or 4. As I've gotten older, and I also had a heart attack about 6 months ago. I'm very lucky to be alive. It's a combination of the two. Just thinking about my life in the past and being given this second chance, heart-wise, it's made me very picky about how I spend my time, with whom I spend it, and how. And I'm finding that photography is just how I speak to the world without opening my mouth, and it's a very important. It's an extension of mine. So I suspect it will be till my dying day. Because when I'm gone, I would like for my photographs to be my contribution.
Yes, well, it's 8 o'clock, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.